Silverdale. There's history here. Silverdale has always been a place for pioneers. The Silverdale of today is a thriving, bustling, forward-looking, growing community, shaped by men and women of vision and dedication, people of dreams, yet not afraid to roll up their sleeves and shape the land with their hands. These are people who remember and celebrate their past and build on it. People who know who they are and what they want to be, because they've never lost sight of who they've been. For 1,000 years, as stately herons have paced the tide line, people have been coming here. Native Americans stopped here. The Suquamish called this place Sockeye, meaning spear it. For here they caught and dried abundant salmon. Here were the fresh waters of Clear Creek cut through to the bay. In 1841, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes led the first American naval expedition to the Puget Sound area. This was a voyage of discovery, a voyage of mapping. Silverdale's Bay was named Dyes Inlet after John Dyes, the ship's naturalist. This was also a voyage of dream-making, for this was just the first. The richness of what they found inspired others to follow. Loggers came to these shores in the early 1850s. By hand, with axes, springboards, and whipsaws, they pushed the forest back, opening to the sky what would be farm and pasture land, studded with miles and miles of stumps. In time, crops and what would be a world-famous chicken cooperative would thrive between the stumps. In the 1880s and 1890s, a town grew here, first named Dickeyville, then nearly Goldendale. But in 1890, the town became Silverdale. While some towns may become the sum of their building materials, statistics of streets and bricks and mortar, a town like Silverdale remains the sum of its people. We are today the sum of 1,000 tales of who we were and celebrations of how we got here, and of not only what we have become, but celebrations of what we want to be and what we will become. A celebration of changes.
To begin with, this part of the country was big timber. The first big change was cutting the big, huge Douglas fir trees. And they were logged by various methods. Here on this particular ridge of mine, they were logged by oxen. At that time, the transportation of logs was by water. You got them down to the bay or wherever there was water, and then you'd float them into the big mills.
The area looked fairly devastated once the logging was completed. Of course, there was a lot of stumps and underbrush and cuttings from the logging. It was quite a task to turn logging land into farming land. And my grandfather acquired a lot of land during that period and subsequently to that, primarily because once the land was logged off, it was viewed as worthless.
The homesteads came in the 1880s or thereabouts. And in this particular case, the valley was cut up in an east-west direction, starting at the Clear Creek Road and going east for a mile and a quarter-mile wide. And that gave the homesteader 160 acres, which was a standard homestead.
My grandparents came from Sweden, and he homesteaded. He had cleared the land and then built a house there, and 2 stories. He had to take the horse and wagon down to, I believe it was Chico at the time, and then row over to Gore's to get the brick, and then to build the foundation of the house.
At that time, there was huge trees around the area. Roads were very difficult for wagons or anything other than logging. So if you're going to go from one area to another, it was by water. My grandfather was the first doctor in Silverdale. He arrived here in 1890. Some people were treated in his home. Many, it was house visits, and so he moved around the area quite a bit. He did a lot of treatment for the Native Americans in the area, and they gave him a dugout canoe that was used a lot for transportation. And rather than paddle it, he put oarlocks on it and extended out the side of the canoe so he could actually row it. One of the first canoes that was rowed, and he could row it at a high rate of speed, and he got around very well.
There's not much good valley land in Kitsap County. This is pretty much all glacial soil. So the problem was what to do with the land and all these huge stumps. The homesteader did the best he could with all these huge stumps and gathering up in piles and burning them, and little groups got together and made a business of going around and using dynamite and power to blow these stumps out or crack them up in pieces so they could be removed from the land, and then the land could be cultivated. In the early years, Silverdale, like most of Kitsap County, was pretty agricultural. And here, particularly in Silverdale, here in Clear Creek Valley, it was dairy farming and chicken raising.
My mother, I remember her talking about, it was her job to go out and collect the eggs. And she always hated eggs and chickens from that time on. But we ate a lot of chicken on the farm. And that seemed to be what most people did in Silverdale.
It seems like everybody had chickens. Everybody had chickens. Banny hens especially. Bannies would be around Tracyton and around Silverdale. You could walk down the streets and there'd be chickens.
Any picture that was ever taken of me when I was a baby is always in the chicken yard with all the chickens.
For a chicken farm, you don't really need an awful lot of acreage. If you've got 5 acres, you've got all you need to set up a what we call a chicken house and start producing eggs.
My grandma, I can remember going out to the chicken coop with her, and this was big, long coops. They weren't just little sheds. Chickens played a very important part in my life with my mom and with my grandma because of all the things that a chicken gave you as far as your eggs. And I loved that when it was butchering time and I got to help clean the innards out. I just didn't mind doing that at all. And even when we'd have an old hen that had quit laying and Dad had chopped its head off and plucked it, and then opening the wood stove and rotating that chicken, singeing all the hair off it. I can still smell that smell. And but how I love chicken and noodles.
Having 5,000 chickens on a farm when you're a little girl was really interesting. I enjoyed it. We got to see chickens hatch, and we would have to help gather the eggs and help clean the eggs. The chickens really didn't appreciate you taking the eggs underneath them. They wanted to hatch them. So I had to figure out some sort of a way where I could gather those eggs without the chickens pecking me. So I got me a coffee can and would stick it over the chicken's head, and then I would reach underneath the hens and gather the eggs without any problem. So it speeded up my job quite a bit.
During the teens, 1917 particularly, there was a provision in the Internal Revenue Code that farmers could organize as co-ops and sell their products as a group. And that's what happened pretty much here in the state of Washington, and to some extent in Oregon and also in California. And under this deal of co-ops, the chicken business really flourished. And what happened was the chicken farmers got together and organized this co-op and got the bright idea that they could produce a lot more eggs than people around here could eat and consume. So what they did, they explored further markets and came up with the idea that they could produce eggs here on the coast and ship them to the big markets on the East Coast, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston, places like that, and still make a little money. So they were able to produce eggs, ship them, and make a living, and that became a big business.
My folks were chicken farmers, and they made a living on about 1,600 chickens a year. And we used to take the eggs down to the co-op when I was a little girl, and I could go in then. I went in and watched them candle eggs. They held the egg up to a light, and they could see if there was a blood spot in it or a crack on the egg.
I used to be able to help candle the eggs, and that was always kind of fun. I remember the excitement of when you'd get a double yolker, whether you were putting it into a cake or whether you put it in your little pan. That was always real fun.
The big thing was the Washington Co-op, which is now actually Cenex Corporation bought all that out. And that was the main place where the feed was sold and the eggs were candled. That all was shipped out by boat.
The headquarters of this co-op was in Seattle, right down on Elliott Avenue, at the foot of Denny Way, right below where they play basketball now. That's the headquarters. And the co-op had branches all over the state. There were about 35 branches. When I came out of college in '36, I went to work for this co-op that had started back in 1917. My job at that co-op was to keep track of all these consignment sales that went to the East Coast. And that was a full-time job. There was eggs being shipped in boxcars, what we call the NADX cars. They were iced boxcars. In terms of dozens, it was 18,000 dozens to a boxcar. And back then there wasn't all these refrigerated, what we call reefer cars now. There was iced cars. So by the time they got to Omaha or someplace, why, they'd have to have another a dose of ice to get across to the other part of the country.
The co-op store and the co-op dock was basically where the pier is now in Silverdale.
Right in front of me here was where the approach was and the dock that went out for the Washington Co-op.
Out on the dock itself is where they stored the grain and so forth. So if you had animals and wanted to pick up grain or seed or heavy goods, sacks of things, then you would drive out onto the dock itself, an old wooden dock, and pick up that stuff.
Where my mother candled eggs, they had hay upstairs, and then they had a slide in there that they would drop the bales on, and it would drop down to the lower floors. So we'd crawl up to the top of the hay barn and slide down the slide all the time. And those doors were never locked either. We went in there to play all the time, and the doors were never locked, and nobody got in trouble or anything, but that was our fun time.
The straw come in and the hay and the feed come in on a boat called the Stanwood. And that had an elevator type thing where they would lift up, the feed would come up because the tide and that's would vary, and they'd get up, and then the laborers on the boat would wheel it off into the building. And also over at the Washington, at the Silverdale Poultry Association where the store was, that's where the coal and stuff come in, and that coal was delivered from that to the different people. Coal was a big fuel in those days.
Well, the Silverdale Poultry Association was, that was the co-op that we had, and that was where our grocery store was.
When my dad would go get groceries, we'd go into the co-op there, and then he had to get feed down on the dock. And I was always scared when I went on that dock because it was just wobbly and all that, but I sat in the truck. He'd get the feed, and then Mother would make a list for him to get at the co-op store, and if I was good, I'd get a lollipop.
Over here sat the Silverdale Poultry Association, And the thing sat in there, and the front of it was right out over in this area over here. The building sat up, and there was a loading platform on the front of it and steps up to it. And in this end of the building over here was a place where they got coal in, and later years pressed the logs and stuff. And they'd bring a barge in and tie it up there and unload the coal, and most of the time it was unloaded by wheelbarrow.
Well, the old co-op store was real interesting because it was like a old-time mercantile type store.
And I can remember going as a small child into the shop, and it was fascinating because unlike shops today, there was sawdust on the floor in the meat area.
I do remember the meat market part because it was in the back of the store, and they had big open barrels of dill pickles, pickled herring, and lutefisk. And I'd never seen anything like that before, these open barrels with these things in them. And I didn't know if they were safe to eat or not, but I liked the dill pickles.
I don't ever remember standing in line with your groceries like you do nowadays, but there was always someone to visit with.
It was just a fun place to go. It was old-fashioned and neat to go to.
Next to the co-op was Emma Lynn's Hotel.
And the hotel was actually an apartment hotel. Well, they had hotel rooms they lent out, but there were several places in the hotel were apartments, and that's where my parents lived at the time we were born.
We are twin sisters, and we were born in Lynn's Hotel in Silverdale in 1928. We were born in the hotel by going to Bremerton because the roads were so poor at that time, and it was snowing so hard, and we were born at 2 o'clock, and I was born at 5 minutes to 2 and her at 2 o'clock in the morning, so the doctor came to the hotel.
Emma Lynn was the, I guess you'd say, proprietor of the hotel. And I know that at the United Methodist Church in Silverdale, the first social room that they made for the ladies for meeting for Bible studies and whichever is called the Emma Lynn Room after her.
We have a room named after Emma Lynn, who was our very first Ladies' Aid Society president. She was quite a woman with a lot of charisma, and she had the only phone in the whole city at the time. Nobody had a phone but Emma Lynn at the hotel. So a lot of people went there and got help, and she saw to it that people had help because she would see people docking at the dock down by the water. And as they came in to the hotel, she would hear their needs, and she would refer them to the women of our church, and we would begin. That's how we really started helping people, because Emma Lynn found the need. And she was a great lady with a wonderful heart.
Back then, most of the transportation when I was a boy was by water. They had little boats that went from Paulsbo and Tracyton that came into Bremerton. That was the mosquito fleet. And the co-ops down here would get them supplies from Seattle. They'd come by this boat. They'd get their food, and if the farmers needed a horse collar or a piece of machinery or something, why, they could order through this co-op, and it'd come on the boat, and they'd go down there and pick it up.
I just remember at the old co-op feed store there, the boat would come in, and you could hear the steam whistle. It was a paddle wheeler, and it brought the feed into the dock.
I think all the products that came to Silverdale at that time and prior to that time, it had to come by water, either by barge for the lumberyard or for the big cooperative store that had coal and everything you could think of. It had to be shipped in primarily by boat of some sort.
The bay was the lifeline. The mosquito fleet traveled it with foot traffic. And then they had the freighters that came into the Washington Co-op to pick up the eggs and to bring in feed for the farmers and so forth. If it hadn't been for the water here, I don't think Silverdale would have existed, because it was the convenience of shipping and so forth from the bay.
We played on the beach a lot. That was our big thing, and fished and off the piers and fishing. Fishing was very good in those days. But we always had a lot of work to do because you raised your own food and stuff most of that time, so you had to work in the garden and do chores, and you heated with wood. And you done all those chores and stuff. And you made sure you done them, because you knew if you didn't get them done and didn't get the wood and stuff, you weren't going to eat, or you're going to be cold. So that was one of the main things in those days.
My mother did a lot of canning. We didn't have a freezer at that time, and we'd go up to Paulsville and pick strawberries. We'd go out in the fields and pick strawberries. And Mother would make strawberry jam and can them.
I was the only granddaughter. Grandma had 6 grandchildren, and I spent many hours with her canning in the basement. We'd have it set up with the wood stove and the copper kettles, and we'd husk corn and shuck peas, and it was always a wonderfully smelling house. Grandma made wonderful rolls.
It was all home cooking in that day. We didn't have a chance to go out. Well, for one thing, you didn't have the money to go out and eat in restaurants very often. And Mother had dinner on the table at 5 o'clock sharp every night. It was just what was expected. And it was just home-cooked food.
Doing dishes on the kitchen stove meant putting water on the stove, on the wood stove, and getting it hot, both for washing the dishes and then rinsing them with some more scalding water, until finally my father was able to talk the owners of the farm into allowing him to put in plumbing.
Mother did not have running water in the house, and I can remember her actually using a wash tub on the back porch. I don't believe that I'm not sure, but I don't believe that there was electricity in the cabin at that time. It wasn't long, of course, before we got electricity in, and Mother got her washing machine, but it still was not an automatic. It was one of the old churning type with a wringer on it, and then we had to hang the clothes outside to dry.
I was raised that you washed clothes on Monday and you ironed on Tuesday, and that's the way Grandma did. And I can remember even as a child sitting on the wood box in the kitchen, and she'd heat her irons on a wood stove and do her pressing.
I don't remember that we had a refrigerator, but I remember there was a hole in the wall with netting around it, wire netting, and there was a wooden box that would be like a apple box, that kind of an idea, with a shelf and everything in it, and that was nailed on to the outside of the house. And that was, but you reached in, you opened a door and reached in from the inside of the house. And I don't know how long we kept milk in there or if we did, but I know that that was kind of like a cooler.
Here we were out in the country, and as I wasn't driving, toddler and a newborn, but we had milk delivery. Of course, it was in bottles. We had a fish vendor would come down around once a week. We had a bakery truck came at least once a week.
We did have a garden and chickens and a cow, which meant having to take care of milk every day.
We milked the cows twice a day, 5 in the morning and 5 at night.
The farm was very self-sufficient. I know that the girls would help with milking before they go to school. the processing with the cream, the butter, all of that was just what I think everybody was doing at that time.
The valley was pretty much devoted to dairy production. Starting down at the lower end of the valley, going right through, in through here, there was one dairy farm after another.
My grandfather would go out and he would move, he'd take down the gate and he would want to move the small herd from one field to the next. And so he would go out and the cattle would just follow him. And I can remember asking him how he did that. And he said, it's easy. He said, you just pick out the leader of the herd and you get the leader to follow you, and then the rest of the herd follows their leader.
Every cow has a personality, just like a bunch of dogs. You know your dogs. You know your cows. Every cow was named, and there was a milk tester that would come around, and they would test the milk for butter fat and for weigh. They'd weigh how much milk they gave.
The little house right behind me is the milk house that they process the milk through. This is what's left of the old Nels Nelson milk house. Over on the wall we have the daily milk record sheet with the names of the cows that he was milking at the time. And he had named these cows Gunna, Betty, Lily, Baby, Crab, Toots, Blossom, Molly, and Queenie. In the old days, they took the milk by wagon down to Silverdale and dropped it off.
Where the sandpiper is, there was what they call the milk stand. The different farmers would bring their 10-gallon cans of milk down there.
And then they would barge it over to Bremerton to sell at the dairy.
I can remember in the mornings going out and milking cows and looking up at the high school up there and watching kids go to school. Well, I was down there in a barn doing my thing as far as the cows were concerned,
When I came here to Silverdale, the only school for my age group was a little 4-room school with 8 grades. The principal taught 7th and 8th grade. I was in the half year of junior high school in Tacoma, where there were 1,200 children in the school. And this was like stepping into a storybook to come and be in a classroom where there was 2 grades and 1 teacher all day long.
Well, the interesting thing about the grade school, when we had the 4 rooms and 2 classes in, the teacher would teach one class, and then then she'd teach the other class. And then the first class would be able to do their homework. We didn't have to do homework because we had half of our day in school was spent waiting for the other teacher to complete her other class. And the teachers were only going to normal school. They did not have to have a large education. And I can say they were absolutely fantastic teachers. However, the teachers couldn't do anything. They were watched closely by the community, so they didn't have much social life, and it was kind of like things you read about in history where the teachers have to be prim and proper.
One of my favorite teachers of all time was our grade school principal, Aubrey Wright. He had also taught my mother in grade school, and he remembered her from being in class, and if you were out of line, he'd say, your mother didn't do things like that when you were in grade school, when she was in grade school.
Jenny Wright School was the grade school, and my mother taught kindergarten there, and I had her in kindergarten. But the principal of the school at that time his name was Aubrey Wright, and Carl Jenny was the superintendent of school. So after they both retired, they named the building, the Jenny Wright Building. It's Jenny-Wright Building.
And in 1943, it would have been the starting school year of 1943 is when the Jenny Wright Building was complete, our Silverdale Elementary School at that time. And that was our first year in that new building, which had been 1943. And something interesting of that era too, Mr. Wright was the principal of the grade school at that time. And during our spring, or not spring break, but during Christmas, when there was that vacation time during the holiday, in Silverdale there wasn't a whole lot of things to be doing in the wintertime, so we would call up Mr. Wright and ask him if we could go in the gym in the new building and play basketball during the day, you know, when it's snowing cold outside, because in those days we seemed to have some pretty good winters in comparison today. He would come down and open up that gym for us so that we could go in there and play basketball. And when he left, he'd say, now make sure the door's closed when you guys are done playing basketball. Huh? That was Mr. Wright.
At that time, the students were the school bus drivers, and it had tandem wheels on it, and it didn't have much traction. And in the winter time, if it rained or if we had a thaw, we'd have to end up getting out of the bus and push it up Buckland's Hill. And of course, at that time, there were no paved roads around.
When we rode the school bus, the drivers of the school buses could be high school students, or they could be other people that drove, or teachers. Just about anybody could drive a school bus in those days.
At that time, when I was in grade school, it was the end of the Depression, and actually at the Jackson Hall or Scout Hall, they had some lunches and stuff down there because some of the kids actually didn't have adequate stuff at home to really live from the Depression. I mean, so they did have a school lunch program at that time, but we normally took our lunch.
My mother had been a cook for the school district. Her and Polly Berg started the school lunch program at Silverdale Elementary in 1941. And eventually my mother graduated up to the high school lunch program, and she was the head cook.
Paul Linder was my history teacher in high school.
Paul Linder was the superintendent of schools. Prior to that, a principal and a coach and a fixture in the community, and totally giving person to make a difference.
I just have a glowing feeling about Paul. He was very well respected, and he treated you with respect, and I think that's a major thing.
One of the main things you'd done in those days, you would sit and listen to the radio. You'd sit in a room, because that's what it was, and you listened to Jack Armstrong and all those type of things. And for the older people, Amos and Andy was a big thing.
We had a radio in the barn where the cows were playing, where the cows were being milked. My father he believed in music. The animals liked music, so in the chicken houses he had music playing. In the barn he had music playing, and my father loved music also.
On a special distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
My folks have always been interested in the news, and we were always listening to news broadcasts.
My wife and I had driven into Bremerton, and so we had to stop at a small store it was on Callow.
I remember sitting in our living room in December of 1941.
December 7th, 1941.
And when I went at the store, the fellow he was upset about something, and so I said, well, I asked him what he was all upset about. So he said, well, haven't you heard the radio yet?
A date which will live in infamy.
It was on a Sunday morning, and we were listening to the news on the radio.
Said the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire.
So that was the first I knew about that. We hadn't even had the radio on that day, and there were no televisions, so we hadn't heard the news that Pearl Harbor had been bombed on the way, drove into town.
It really hit home with my folks because my father worked at Keyport at the time, and a month earlier he had been picked to go to Pearl Harbor Station in Hawaii, and because my mother was expecting, one of his friends volunteered to take his position over there, and so my folks wouldn't have to move over there. And they were quite worried about the people. The Johnsons, I believe they were, Ted Johnson and his wife, they were worried whether they had been harmed from the attack.
When the Army come in after December 7th, I watched as the stuff moved into Silverdale, a lot of it on the road right below me.
It was very interesting. I can remember like it was yesterday when I woke up in the middle of the night and I heard this commotion, and you know how a bulldozer sounds when the tracks and stuff are going down on the road pavement type thing. I can remember crawling out of bed on my hands and knees and going over to the window and looking out. I was upstairs, that's the house there on Silverdale Way, and looking south, and all I could see was trucks and people moving around and tanks and all kinds of Army equipment. I thought, oh my gosh, they've invaded us, it's over with, we're going to be captured. I was scared to death, and I was like 6 years old at that time, or 7 years old, and it was really scary when they first came into town.
You had blackout curtains on your windows that you put down at night so that no light come out. You put sandbags in your attic for incendiary bombs. I mean, things were very well mobilized in a hurry.
Then they just start putting up barracks and tents, and in our schoolyard there at Silverdale Elementary, where Linderfield is now, there was barge balloons out there and searchlights and anti-aircraft guns up on the hill on Munson.
During the war years, the community was very supportive, and we had blackouts. We had barrage balloons popping up all over the country. They had little groups of soldiers with the barrage balloons, and every now and then they would have them all up at one time, and you could just look all over the sky and see these. And I guess they were to keep the enemy aircraft from coming in and shooting at the bases at either Bremerton or Keyport.
They were very critical that these barrage balloons were up because they could come over Silverdale, and the way it was built with the open area, as you know, the Clear Creek Valley, and get a direct pass at the Navy Yard by coming through there. So Silverdale was a very important place.
I'd always just walked across the schoolyard to go to, if I had to go to the store. And so one day I started to go across there, and there was a soldier with a rifle on his shoulder. This called me to halt, and I didn't understand what he said, so I just kept on going until he took the rifle down off his shoulder. I thought he really wanted to talk to me then, so I stopped, and he said, "You can't go through here anymore." And I told him, "Well, I just lived right there." And he said, "It doesn't matter, you have to go around from now on." There's no traffic through the schoolyard, through their camp.
High school immediately was taken over, and all these soldiers came in. They had to have a place to take showers and clean up and get water for their men. And they would come to the high school, and those of us who were used to using the PE showers for our own use had to go home and take our showers because they had the soldier boys coming in all the time to get cleaned up until they built a actual shower house and that sort of thing on the field there right near the grade school.
We also had on the school grounds a tower where volunteers manned it around the clock.
Mother and I volunteered for the Sky Watch. They had built a tower for watching for airplanes and had a phone in so that you could call a certain number to let them know if you saw any airplanes in the sky.
And I had, I think, a 12 to 6 shift, midnight to 6, one day a week with a friend. And we never had any planes. Meanwhile, I'm sure that in the woods, radar was picking up, but we all felt we were doing our part.
After December 7th, Silverdale was a real boom. The Navy Yard increased the people. I believe there was 70,000 people working there. I don't, some of these figures. But Silverdale became a place.
And of course, housing was in such short supply that everybody had doubled up all over. And they rented, I think in Bremerton, closer to the shipyard, they even rented the same bed at different hours of the day, I've been told.
Down at my aunt's farm, she had ceased farming right before that. The old farmhouse was there, and along Silverdale Way coming into Silverdale, before you get to Byron Street, over the bank where the apartments are now, there was some chicken houses there. And the family, my aunt's family, and we worked on it, we fixed all those chicken houses up, and they were all rented to people working in the yard.
My grandfather at that time had just passed away, and my grandmother still had some of the chicken houses left from when they were chicken farming, and they had made 2 of the end units into places where people could live, and there weren't much to look at, and they weren't very warm to be in the winter because the wind blew right through them, but they were places that the people could stay, and they were sorely needed, and a lot of people in the area did that.
During the war years, when there were so many military around and their wives wanted to come to be with near their husbands, my mother rented space. By that time, during the war years, we were all away from home. So our bedrooms were used by the wives and children of military people that were in the area. Mother also made dinners for others that were staying in just rooms and didn't have any place to eat. They would come and have dinner at Mom's.
There was rationing during the war, and that was very interesting. But you must realize that all these folks came through the Depression and knew how to save and how to share and so on.
Meat was rationed. That was with a red stamp. There was a blue stamp for sugar and something else, and I forget, there was a green stamp. I believe that was something to do with canned vegetables or something. Gasoline was rationed, tires were rationed.
We had gas, and we could help people in that manner a bit, and get extra sugar. Or shoes. Shoes were a big item, especially with a family with growing children. And the shoes were not good quality.
I had shoes that had braided cardboard soles that were on end, and you wore them one time down Sydney Hill. I lived there at that time. One time down the hill and your shoes were gone. But that would be what you had to have. And then we had wooden sole shoes because of the leather shortage. And my little wooden toe shoes had slats across. And so going down the hills then was, like going down a hill of ice. You'd take about 4 steps and land.
I know that one of my memories of that time was wearing a cut-down coat. And then again, all of us had cut-down coats. So they'd take a woman's good quality fabric garment and cut it down to a child's size. And secretly, we might be very proud of what our mothers had done because they might put a lace collar or a velvet collar. I remember amber buttons down this brown coat. And we recognized the skills of our mothers.
In those days, we had what was called a victory garden. And I can remember my dad, we always had a huge garden. In fact, that whole section there where it's actually blacktop now to the north of the house is a garden.
And eventually we raised our own meat. We used to buy chickens and raise them to frying stage and have a wholesale slaughtering. My husband built his own freezer and we lived out of it. We had vegetables and fruit and meat and everything. We literally lived out of it. And as a result, we circumvented a lot of the rationing because we had our own supply.
Growing up in the Silverdale area as a child was, especially with World War II going on, was very serious. We had to raise all our food. We had to turn our lights out, have the windows blacked out at night. And it always made you didn't really feel that secure as to what the future had for you. Because there was always a threat that we were going to be bombed. There was someone always in the town getting word that someone didn't come back from overseas. And, you know, kids that you used to see walking to high school and went overseas and got killed. So it wasn't until after the war that we really started feeling secure again, and that took some doing, I think.
Toward the end of World War II, there was a railroad, first railroad in Kitsap County, and it went into Bangor to bring ammunition. And they went right through the back of our 5 acres. Fortunately, we had a grove of trees because it never had been completely cleared. And there was the clearing first and then the construction. And when they blasted some of the stumps, they thought they were out in the wilds, I guess, and they put too much dynamite and big chunks. That was our bombardment of the war. Came over and hit the top of the house, broke out some of the fence. It was quite scary for a while. Well, then they rolled all of the logs over and made big piles along the right-of-way. And the children used to sit out there. That was their grandstand. And they could watch all the construction of the railroad. And that was part of their education.
When we lived down in Silverdale, which was in a house we bought from Ed Nelson, we were just catty-corner from the Methodist church, but across the street from the church was where the Army, when they were there, that's where they raised and lowered the flag every morning and every night. And I can remember being there when they'd bring the flag down and they'd play taps. I remember being so proud to be an American.
Silverdale, at the end of World War II, started growing because more people were moving into the area. During the war, the service had brought a lot of Navy personnel in, a lot of people to work in the Navy Yard, and they liked the area. And so those that were career Navy people, military, they retired, looked for a place to live. They thought Silverdale would be a good place. Actually, all of Kitsap County is that way. That helped to build Silverdale into what it is today.
Well, the family moved from New Jersey, my brother, sister, and parents, and we had a 36 Chev and a 27-foot mobile home, and it was during the Second World War. I don't recall the community much, but one of my impressions were of the people, and I found them to be extremely friendly. Coming from the East Coast, there were many people, and striking up friendships was quite difficult back east, although we had friends and so on. Out here it was just an exceptionally friendly community, and no time at all why it seemed like everyone accepted you and you fit in nicely. My parents had built the house, but my brother, sister, and I, we all helped with it and had many chores to do, and that was rather interesting. The house was built before we had electricity to it, so it was all handsaw work, and they didn't have the power tools they have now. And I do remember when we lived in the house the first winter, I think we had 3 wood stoves. One was in the basement and one was in the kitchen for cooking, and the other was the fireplace. And my brother and I cut quite a bit of firewood, and I don't think we complained about it. It was just one of the things that was to be done.
The winter of 42 and 43, we had quite a snowstorm here. There were no snowplows in the area, so we had the Army was still here then, so they'd run their trucks up and down the road so that at least the snow was packed down and people could drive on it then.
The Army trucks brought things out to the farmers and brought their produce and things in. I mean, their eggs and things like that. Brought them in because just regular trucks couldn't do it. But the Army allowed the soldiers to drive the trucks out to the farms.
It really worked out quite well, I think, to have the Army here for that time. There was really quite a bit of snow, and it lasted quite a while.
They used to block off Buckland Hill when it snowed.
They would close it off down to where the highway is now.
And we used to sled all the way down Buckland Hill.
And we would just sled night and day.
The hill, which was called Munson Hill, it was called Callow Hill at that time, and that's the one that ran right alongside of our house there on Silverdale Way. We would slide down there in the winter when there was a lot of snow, and we'd come sliding down that hill across Silverdale Way into the grade school area there. Someone would stand down by the road to make sure no cars were coming, but if you had 3 or 4 cars come by in an hour, it was a lot of cars in those particular times.
I can remember my dad bringing home a sled for me, and that was a big deal. And when I was a kid, and at that time we used to have more snow than we do now, and so in the winter you did that, and if the weather was bad, well, as I say, we all were pretty avid readers.
We had to find our own entertainment, and books mostly was our own entertainment.
I read every book I could get my hands on, and our whole family were a bunch of readers.
Books have always been terribly important to me. And when I was living in a town, I went to the Carnegie Library for storytelling before I ever was in school. And then my family always told stories, and we just grew up that way.
As a family, we all love to read, and so in that respect, I think library is one of our top interests because I just feel that people who do a lot of reading are well versed in the area that they live in, the area that they serve in, and so I find it to be a very powerful tool as far as the library is concerned.
I remember that the Silverdale Library began in the lower level of the Silverdale Methodist Church. There was a room set aside for the library. And Ray Hess and Catherine Hess were very involved with the library and active with it.
A lot of the staff was volunteer. And so in the beginning, Silverdale had our first station in the basement Methodist Church Sunday school rooms. And that was right on the corner of what eventually became our library. And that was until the end of the war, when all of those barracks and buildings that the Army had on the school grounds reverted to the school district. And of course they sold off a lot. People were eager to build and get lumber and so forth that they'd been denied. And there was a little 16 by 16 foot building.
Eventually that was moved up to the street side corner of the school property. And the book collections of the library were moved from the church, which was next door, into that building.
And that's what we had for, the next 25 years. Early on, library branches and headquarters organized Friends of the Library.
The Friends of the Library was organized, as far as I know, in the very late 60s or early 70s. I was the first president. I was asked to be president at that time. We had a group of probably 30 or 40 people. We raised funds for whatever the library needed that perhaps the KRL could not provide at that time. We became more active again just a few years ago when this idea of a new library, the hope for a new library, was rekindled, and our efforts are aimed at raising money because we know that when the new library is built, which it will be someday, that there are things that the Friends of the Library can do to enhance the building and the working conditions for the employees.
The community campus is planned to have a library. Right now, Silverdale has a very small library. It's a very busy library, and they need to have more space. And our library system is one of the best in the state, and people that live there are very excited about having better access.
One of the most outstanding things that's happened in the community, and it took a great deal of effort, was the purchase of the property on which the community center will be built. It was Dr. Severson was the owner of that property, and he passed away very shortly after the purchase. But Commissioner Lent, and with the help, of course, of other commissioners, because it's not a single decision, but she worked very hard with the agents handling the property to have that become a reality.
My first year of office, one of my largest or best accomplishments was to purchase 7.5 acres of land next to the existing community center. It gives Silverdale and the Central Kitsap over 12 acres for a community campus. The main reason for buying that property was to build a library.
We will have an opportunity to have a piece of property that can be planned and structured in such a way that it will benefit everyone within the community.
The community campus, all three commissioners unanimously decided to purchase that property. It will be a great community center, and that's what we're looking forward to, being kind of the hub of Silverdale, if you will.
Way back when they went from all water transportation and built the first road to Bremerton in Silverdale, which actually is the same road that is behind the Bogart's drug building and runs to the beach there now. That road run all along the waterfront here and went to Bremerton. That was a milestone when they done that. And then the next biggest thing that happened, of course, was that brought different things in, was the Second World War, when they really modernized the roads and stuff. And then, if you want to summarize it briefly, the next big thing then was the Trident base out there, and that just opened everything up. That's the big thing that really created the mall and everything.
Silverdale didn't grow much until probably the news release was in 1973 when the Trident, when Kitsap was selected as the Trident base, and at that time, lots of people in anticipation of the growth started looking at Silverdale more seriously as a place to do business, and we knew there'd be quite a bit of housing needed for the Trident base, and the construction of it was major employment. Many people coming to the area on a temporary basis. It was a boom town for about 2 or 3 years while the base was being built.
It took a number of years. The planning on it started in about 1975. The first sub, the Ohio, if I remember correctly, arrived in about 1980. The infrastructure, in the sense of building all the roads and schools and what have you, took probably a good 10 years from 75 up until 85, if I use my dates right, because all the subs came in very gradually. You know, you had the first sub in 1980, and then about every, if I remember, about every 9 months you had a new submarine arriving. And so there was a gradual build-up of the population, but you also had a build-up of the population just to build the base. And growth feeds growth, so that once you had people coming in for the Navy, you had people coming in for retail stores and what have you, and all of that dramatically changed Silverdale.
Silverdale went from having one high school to having 3 high schools. Silverdale is the largest school district in the county, where it was one of the smaller ones when I first came here.
I can't tell you how many grade schools there are in the district, and there's about 3 junior highs and 3 high schools. And then maybe 14 or 15 at least grade schools.
Virtually every elementary school in Silverdale up until 5 years ago was built because of the built or added on because of the Trident money. And it's interesting. A little aside on that is that I know at the time, and this is another good example where the government wants to do one thing and people don't always necessarily want to do the other. And I think I've learned as I get older that that's healthy. But when I was young and wanted to control everything, we wanted to put as much of the population into East Bremerton as possible, because that's where we were building sewers and roads and you had all the infrastructure there. So the theory is you have the people live where the infrastructure is. And so you build the schools there. And lo and behold, the schools there, people are going to fill up. But I remember having discussions, particularly with Paul Linder, who's superintendent of schools, who said, the people in Silverdale really would prefer to live out on the west side. They want to live out towards Seabeck. And I'm saying, we can't build schools out to Seabeck. We can't run infrastructure that far out. But he would say, well, whether you have infrastructure or not, that's where they're going to want to live. Well, being in government, we were able to kind of ignore that advice and do what we're going to do. And so we built a lot of schools on the east side, which I think now are half empty. And the new schools are being built on the west because that's where people want to live. So, government can try to do some things, but you can't force people to do what they don't want to do. You can make life a little better for them, you can provide the infrastructure, but if they're willing to pay for something and live out in the woods and not have the roads and the sewers and have to drive their kids to schools, and that's where they want to be, more power to them. It's a free country, and that's where they should be.
Well, Trident was the biggest factor in changing the way Silverdale is and was, in fact, the whole county. Because it was such a big development, what was rural, sleepy Silverdale with the old town as the core was the impetus for creating a regional shopping center that's now where the Silverdale Mall is now, and the growth that occurred around that.
When the mall was first under construction, there wasn't a whole lot going on around the mall, but it didn't take very long at all for a lot of that retail to begin to pop up surrounding the shopping center. And of course, with all that additional retail came additional traffic and cars.
Malls do that. Malls transform communities, and it certainly transformed Silverdale. And some things were done right, and I would say some things were done wrong. I mean, I wish in hindsight we had, probably had a better traffic plan on how to deal with all the traffic. I don't think anybody could ever have imagined the kind of car traffic we were going to wind up with. And in part because we're much more mobile than we were 20 years ago. Every family has 2 or 3 cars now. But the positives, on the side from that, is we're able to go back and make up for some errors. And I think of the Clear Creek Trail as a great example, where nobody really thought about building a Clear Creek Trail back when all this growth was being done. But because of the work of some community leaders, and I think of Tex Lewis is a great example, Mary Earl is another one, that said, hey, before we completely destroy this corridor, let's kind of preserve some of this land here. Let's build this walkway. Let's have a little quiet respite in the middle of this urban area. And my hat's off to leaders like that who were able to pull that off.
Clear Creek Trail is something that's very interesting, and it can really be described very, very simply. And you can describe it by saying 2 people's names, and that's Paul Britton and Tex Lewis.
We started the trail with nothing. We had a dream and an idea. We developed a master plan, and we started building. Clear Creek is kind of unique in that it does flow north and south. It starts at the south end on Dyes Inlet, where it dumps into the salty water of Puget Sound, and it goes north up along the valley. It's a spring-fed stream. So it springs out of the ground and it dumps in the ocean. It's been truly a community project. We've had contractors donate labor and materials to build our interpretive center and build the trail. We've had people that have donated material and money to where we were short on donated materials.
I am so proud of this community for what they have done. People with shovels in hands, and Tex as a mentor for so many young people.
Early on, we formed an alliance with Central Kitsap High School. A teacher there, Marie Crum, has some classes of sophomore, juniors, and seniors. And every Earth Day on April 22nd, plus or minus a few days, 100 of those kids will march down here and we'll build a section of trail. We then use the rest of the year to, with other groups of kids, including the alternative detention youth, to put in the rest of the trail. We set our target for ourselves of what we want to achieve that year, and every year we achieve it. As you can imagine, you get 100 kids out here, you need a lot of wheelbarrows, you need a lot of shovels. So I've been able to turn to the Silverdale Water District for tools on Earth Day, wheelbarrows, shovels. They'll even provide 2 or 3 workers to help direct the kids. The Parks Department, and then almost all our adult volunteers will bring tools when we need them.
Those children who help and clean up the trail and help to forge their way through a new section are learning lessons that they can never learn anywhere but through the instruction of Tex Lewis and how to do something that needs to be done in an engineering way. And I think it is an impact for them, for their life, those young people who help him. And then the organization itself is a very, very good one, making a huge difference. And the trail is going to be a very special part of the future of Silverdale.
Working for 11 years with the Clear Creek Task Force, I've become even a bigger part of the community and the leaders here. It's a really important group that are involved in Silverdale because, to me, I think because it isn't an incorporated city. We have to work a little harder to make sure we preserve land, conservation, greenway corridors, as well as history and natural heritage.
In any community, open space is very important. I think providing recreation opportunities for people who live in that community is important. I think providing places for kids to go where they can enjoy nature is important. I think providing wildlife habitat is important.
It's been a satisfying project for a couple of reasons. One is all the volunteers that I'm associated with, or we have been associated with, we've almost become a family over the last few years. And then we meet a lot of wonderful kids. We see what kids can do, and motivated and properly directed. And then a lot of the kids now are starting to bring their kids out. So it's been a real pleasure to watch the community grow and the stream grow.
I contribute the nice growth of Silverdale to the Water District's engineer, Paul Pazuki. He came in and said, nobody will build anything unless they put in landscaping and sidewalks and this and that, you know. And I think Silverdale is a pretty town the way it is. And I think we owe a lot of it to the Water District.
The Water District was
was formed in 1929, and it came about because the community of Silverdale was without a reliable water supply. The original owners of the system would actually shut the water supply off to Silverdale when there was a shortage, so they would remain in water service. So the community got together and decided to form a water district and put together a reliable water supply. There were 3 commissioners that were elected to the board by the community, and the community was made up of about 67 customers that formed the district.
The growth of the water district was successful and painless because of the team that worked on it.
Definitely with operating a water system in 1984 compared to 2004 has changed immensely.
When I first came to work here, we didn't have a backhoe. We dug everything by hand. We got a backhoe in 1989 or 1990. So the first 4 years, if you wanted to dig it, you dug it by hand, putting water services in. I was really thrilled when the backhoe showed up in our life.
Since coming to work for the water district, there have been a board of commissioners that have been tremendous to work with. They are looking out for the Silverdale as a whole. They look to the future, looking at the future growth needs of the community, and their responsibility is to set policy and assure that the water district is going to meet the needs of the community, not only today, but also tomorrow.
When people ask us how our relationship started with Silverdale Water, some things, maybe it's destiny or sometimes it's by accident, but one of the first employees of the water district was a man named David Pelkey. Well, he's a retired Bremerton Fire Department lieutenant. And after he retired from the fire department, he came out to work for the water district. And so there was a natural affinity for him to do things with the fire department. Of course, the fire department in its infancy was looking for more and more hydrants. And Dave was our man that would get out there and put a hydrant in a place where we needed it, so we made sure we had protection, especially for schools and churches and places like that.
It began in June 22nd of 1942. The citizens voted, I believe it was 67-8, a vote of the citizenry at that time to form a fire district.
It was small, and we didn't have all this fancy equipment. A lot of it was made by the firemen themselves.
Charlie Snediger was one of the guys that started that, and they had the old fire station was down in old Silverdale down there, and had an old one truck with an old Mack with a tank on it and a small pickup with something on it that you could pump water with.
One of the first ambulance we had was a hearse that one of the firemen purchased down in Oregon, and we called it the Black Mariah because that's just what it was a hearse, and people would go and pick up a person that was ill or anything and put them in a hearse. They didn't exactly appreciate that.
Some of the changes that I've seen in the fire service over the last 30 years that I've been here, many years ago when the tones used to go out, we would actually receive a phone call to local homes, and then that volunteer, a family member of the volunteer, would make other phone calls to then call other members of the community to help respond. And the response was totally by all volunteers. We had nobody that was paid back then in the early 70s when I started. And essentially all volunteers helped everybody in the community 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nowadays what we get is we get a 911 dispatch through an enhanced 911 system that actually triggers a dispatch to our fire stations typically in 60 seconds or less.
It's a much quicker response to the emergency, and as the volunteers are able to get from their homes to their respective stations and their apparatus and then respond, and they assist the career individuals.
Now one of the goals we have is to be able to roll a fire engine out of a station within 60 seconds of being toned out. So we're essentially providing a service out on the street much quicker than we used to 30 years ago.
When I began the department, or with the department as a volunteer, one of my first training exercises was a fire down on the waterfront.
I remember we helped burn down several of the old buildings, which is now where the park is down in Silverdale, the hotel and several of the surrounding buildings.
Silverdale Hotel was made into apartments after the function of a hotel was no longer economically feasible or viable. And eventually the repair cost and so on was such that they discontinued the renting out the apartments. And when this happened, the rodents took over, and it was decided, I think the Port Commission asked the fire department to burn it down.
I think back then the buildings that were down in Old Silverdale were in such disrepair that it was a landmark, but it seemed like that was kind of the natural progression for that area, is to start with something new. And I think they've made a nice area of it down there at the park.
The Silverdale Waterfront County Park probably would not be in existence today had it not been for the Port of Silverdale's purchase of the property when it was available, and subsequently trading that property with the county for adjoining waterfront property where our pier and boat launch are now.
Port was created by 1920 when the people petitioned. There were probably less than 100 people that were involved in the petition, and it's a pretty good sized area. It takes all of from Bangor all the way over to include all of what's now Silverdale, a little bit south of Silverdale, and over to the top of Buckland Hill, which would include Ridgetop now.
The port is set up for actually water-oriented things.
Because of the uniqueness of the ports in Kitsap County, a lot of what we do is kind of secondary to what most people would think is economic growth. We actually are more involved in recreational use.
This bay is fairly shallow all over, and so where the transient moorage part is, we dredge that to -10. That means then you got about 6 foot of water in there actually on a zero tide. That makes it good for most boats to be in there. Right now we're in the process of upgrading our master plan and our comprehensive plan.
Depending on what the planner determines, that ultimately we'll have some kind of a small business park or something that is much more closely aligned with our economic development charter.
Whaling Days was started when a bunch of people got together, and a lot of them over at Larry's shop over there, and we decided we should be doing something, and we decided to start this Whaling Days. Glenn Gordon was involved in that.
I felt Silverdale needed a family-oriented celebration, festival, that people could attach themselves to and bring identity and cohesiveness to our community.
It was such a stretch to think why we would have Whaling Days in Silverdale, because Silverdale had nothing to do with the whaling community in any way whatsoever. But our first president and good leader of the chamber, Glenn Gordon, thought, well, you got to have something that's exciting, and Silverdale was well known for the chicken industry, but we didn't think it would be that we could have a community event that was related to the chicken industry and any name that might be associated with it. So we just decided, well, let's throw it all out and just go for Whaling Days.
You cannot imagine a community being more cohesive and more enthusiastic. I used to tell people, if you want to do something, put your hand in the air and you've got a job. And people put their hands in the air and they got things done.
Well, one of the first big floats that the chamber was involved with was the Big Whale. And a fellow that had an automotive shop in Silverdale was quite responsible for it. Larry Johnson was his name, and he got quite a few of his friends and associates to work very hard on it.
Well, it was a group project, and we welded up a framework, and it was going to be just a little one, and all of a sudden it was 40 feet long and 12 feet wide and 12 feet high, and then we had Carl Rasmussen had a upholstery shop, and he made a cover for that whole thing out of burlap, and then we painted that.
We had a Name the Whale contest, and she became named Wendy.
Well, I worked out back in a logging camp, out on the timber trail, oh, but the call of the sea took a hold on me, a whalin' I would go. Silverdale, Silverdale, home of the timberjack and whale, one more ride on the devil's tail, we'll go home tomorrow.
The Lions Club started the parade the first year and still are affiliated with it. I went to the sheriff, who was Art Morgan at the time, and told him I thought we was going to need some more deputies involved, and he was quite a guy, and he said, oh, I doubt very much whether you'll have hardly anybody show up there at all, and but I will give you a couple of deputies. Well, we had about 10,000 the first whaling days. The state policeman told us, it just happened to be visiting there. He knew how to estimate crowds, and of course Art Morgan was very astounded that it went like it did, and in later years we had lots of deputies.
We enjoy participating in the Whaling Days Festival as well, and we've got some deputies that do the long canoe races. We have deputies involved in the races and the walks, for the charity walks ahead of time. We also are, I would call us a major participant in the parades.
Whaling Days is a fun, exciting time each year, and the fire department has been involved in it for many years. Each year we put vehicles, our fire and a medical apparatus into the parade, and people kind of enjoy that. It's a lot of fun.
Where the Whaling Days today is matured quite a bit from what it was in its early years. The parade is probably one of the old standards from what it used to be. We have the Whale of a Run that's been around for many years, the foot race that benefits the hospice organization. In recent years, the Rotary Club has added in the Great Duck Race down on the waterfront.
All the money that's raised is kept by the Rotary and then dispersed into needy organizations in the community who ask for what they refer to as the duck bucks.
Whaling Days is over 30 years old, and it gets bigger and better every year. I love the fact that it is a community event, that it draws more people all the time, and that it remains in Old Town Silverdale as one of their initial historical things. People will talk about Whaling Days, I hope, forever.
I think it has helped hold the community together. I think that Silverdale has a very strong core element of people that are concerned about the community as a whole.
I think that that there truly is a unique population here of people who have learned to get along and learned to do well with one another, and have brought a great sense of humor to our community. And I think that that's the one thing I note, is that there's always something funny to talk about, or something funny that's happened. And those are the things that enhance everybody's life.
I think that the community fortunately has maintained the friendliness that it has had through the years. I still have comments from newcomers coming in that, oh, how wonderful it is, the people out here are so friendly.
We really are unusual in my feeling that we have a sense of community in Silverdale and an opportunity to be contributing to every segment of that community by just being participatory, to be caring, to be knowing that there are people in need, all of the wonderful organizations that help those in need, and there's a great many. And yet we have a broad scope of economic and social issues, and yet everyone seems to come together to try to help and be of service. And so that's why I'm glad that this is my community.
Thank you.